Cadet Blake sat alone on the edge of the barracks, her back straight and eyes focused on the dim light filtering through the window. She wasn't part of the conversations in the mess hall or the off-duty chatter. In the common areas, she never shared her experiences. She never laughed at the jokes. Her boots were always clean, her uniform crisp, her posture perfect. But her silence, her refusal to engage, made her an outcast. The other soldiers had their own stories, their own badges of honor. They spoke openly of the battles they had fought, the missions they'd survived, and the comrades they'd lost. Their war stories filled the air, peppered with laughs and boastful tones. They weren't cruel, at least not at first. But when Blake was around, the stories changed. Her presence seemed to interrupt their sense of camaraderie, as if she didn't belong. She didn't have the battle scars or the combat patch to make her part of their world. Blake's first few weeks had been the hardest. She trained harder than anyone, always the first to rise and the last to leave. But that was nothing extraordinary. They all trained hard. It was expected. What set her apart was how she carried herself, how she never asked for recognition, never sought validation. She ate alone, her eyes scanning her food with the same intensity she gave to her drills. She didn't make friends, and she didn't need to. The men in her unit noticed. Some tried to break the ice, to make small talk, but when they saw the look in her eyes distant, unreadable, they quickly retreated. They took to calling her Paper Soldier, a nickname that circulated without her knowledge at first. They joked about her perfect uniform, her spotless boots. She never flinched. When Sergeant Keeley mockingly quipped that she must be too busy with paperwork to get her hands dirty, a few snickered. She simply nodded, not a word escaping her lips. Her isolation became the source of their amusement. She was the odd one, the woman who couldn't possibly have seen real combat. The others had the experience, the blood, the stories. Blake was just an enigma, a clean slate with no proof of what she had endured. They assumed that her lack of scars, her quiet, unwavering demeanor, meant she was nothing more than a pretender. They were wrong, but Blake never corrected them. She let the jokes continue, and with each day, the weight of their dismissals grew heavier. Blake had learned to live with the solitude, even welcome it. When the others went out to relax or joke around, she remained behind, sitting on the floor of her room, the only place where she could feel a sense of control. She chose the hard floor over the cot, not because it was comfortable, but because it reminded her of something else, of nights spent on colder ground, in places where the air was thick with the smell of dust and death. These were memories no one else could see, not in her face, not in her clothes, not in the way she moved, but they were there, buried deep. The other soldiers never asked why she slept on the floor or why she never joined their social circles. They only saw her as the woman without a past, but that past was what shaped her, a past filled with horrors that she carried silently, like a heavy weight she couldn't let go of. She had bled like the rest of them, but her scars were not the kind that could be seen with the naked eye. Her ability to endure without complaint, to stay quiet while they mocked her, was her strength. It wasn't that she didn't feel the sting of their words. She felt them deeply. Every insult, every snicker, every dismissive glance. But Blake had learned long ago that her strength was in her silence. The quiet she carried was her shield. The suffering she endured was her secret. She didn't need to prove herself, not to them, not to anyone. She would simply do her job. She would keep her head down and continue to be the soldier they didn't understand. Her actions would speak louder than any words ever could. The days blurred into one another. Training, drills, tests, all with the same routine, the same perfection. Each moment spent proving herself without a single word of acknowledgement. The others came to expect her quiet resolve. It was as though they had grown numb to her presence, writing her off as nothing more than a figure in the background. But Blake knew, in time, they would have to see her for what she truly was. She wouldn't have to shout it. She wouldn't have to make a scene. They would realize, eventually, they would see the woman they had written off, the one they had called Paper Soldier, and they would understand. When that moment came, Blake would be ready. Until then, she would remain the silent soldier, the one who carried her past in the quietest of ways, never asking for acknowledgement, never begging for respect. She would wait, letting her strength speak when the time was right. The morning air was thick with tension as Major Donovan walked down the row of cadets, clipboard in hand, his eyes sharp and calculating. The sound of boots striking the floor was the only noise in the otherwise silent room. Blake stood at attention, her body perfectly still, her face betraying no emotion as the inspection began. The soldiers around her were accustomed to the daily ritual, but for Blake, it always felt different. The weight of the stares, the whispers, the judgments, it was all too familiar. Sergeant Keeley, who was always the loudest, stood to the side, his arms folded across his chest as he watched the inspection unfold. As Major Donovan moved past each cadet, he muttered brief instructions, checking off his clipboard. When he reached Blake, Keeley leaned in, his voice barely a whisper but loud enough for the others to hear. "Look at her," he said, loud enough for the whole room to catch his tone. Clean boots, spotless uniform, no battle scars. Must be from all that paperwork. Huh. The cadets snickered, some covering their mouths to hide their grins, others snorting openly. Blake didn't react. Her eyes stayed straight ahead, her posture unbroken. She had heard it all before, but today, something felt different. The mocking didn't feel as sharp as it had in the past, as if it had lost some of its bite. But maybe that was just her growing numbness to the cruelty. Major Donovan glanced briefly at Blake, not catching the implication in Keeley's voice, but his sharp eyes lingered on her for a moment longer than usual. He moved in front of her, clipboard held against his chest, waiting for her to respond as was customary. Blake's salute was perfect, as always, her arm steady, her stance rigid. As she raised her arm, the faint ink marks on her wrist caught Donovan's attention. His eyes narrowed, and for a split second, the noise in the room seemed to fade into the background. Blake's arm remained at attention, but Donovan's gaze dropped to the faint, nearly imperceptible tally marks on her wrist. They were small, barely visible unless one was looking closely, yet they stood out against her otherwise perfect uniform. He shifted slightly, the tip of his pen pressing against the clipboard. "What are those marks?" Donovan asked, his voice carrying a sudden edge of curiosity. Blake's expression didn't change. She didn't flinch. "My kill count, sir," she said, her voice cold and controlled, but laced with an undercurrent of something deeper, something the others couldn't grasp. The words landed in the room like a bomb, the atmosphere instantly shifting. The laughter stopped. The room fell silent, the cadets' eyes widening in unison. Even Sergeant Keeley, who had been the first to mock her, straightened up, his smirk gone. Major Donovan's eyes flickered, a faint recognition crossing his face. He didn't speak for a moment, his mind clearly processing what she had just said. Blake stood perfectly still, the silence in the room now a heavy weight pressing down on everyone. "Explain," Donovan finally said, his tone more serious than it had been before. His interest piqued. Blake didn't hesitate. "Operation Raven Shield," she said. "Northern Syria. My squad was ambushed. No backup." She paused briefly, her gaze unwavering. "I completed the mission and extracted 2 wounded, 5 confirmed hostiles." Her words were matter of fact, as if she was reciting a simple training exercise. But the gravity of the statement hit everyone like a freight train. This was not a story of some hypothetical war. This was real. Donovan blinked, almost imperceptibly. He glanced down at the clipboard, but his attention was no longer on the list of names. His focus was entirely on Blake. He knew the operation. It had been classified, and the report had been vague, a mere mention of a lone survivor. "That op was classified," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. "Only one agent survived." Blake nodded once, her eyes steady. "Call sign Echo, sir, that was me." The words hung in the air, and for the first time since she had arrived, the entire room understood something they hadn't before. Blake was not just another cadet, not just another silent, disciplined recruit. She had been through something far beyond what any of them could fathom. Major Donovan's hand tightened around the clipboard, but he didn't look away from her. He processed the information quickly, the wheels turning in his mind. "You're, Echo?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper now. Not out of disbelief, but something else respect. Blake didn't respond. She didn't need to. The silence in the room was enough. Keeley's face, once filled with mockery, now reflected something else. The sudden shift in his demeanor was palpable, as if the air had been sucked out of him. The cadets who had laughed, who had thought they knew her, now found themselves unsure of the woman standing before them. They had mistaken her silence for weakness, her cleanliness for inexperience, her solitude for insecurity. But now, they understood. She wasn't just any soldier. The rest of the day moved on in a haze, the atmosphere charged with a newfound respect for Blake, though no one spoke of it. Major Donovan called her to his office later, and she obeyed without question. Inside the office, Donovan didn't sit. He stood across from her, his eyes locked on the tally marks on her wrist again, his expression unreadable. After a long pause, he finally spoke. "I read the after-action report," he said quietly. "You saved 12 lives. 2 of them were ours." He met her gaze then, a flicker of something in his eyes. Guilt, understanding, or perhaps both. "Why didn't you say anything?" Blake's response was soft, almost imperceptible. "Because they didn't come back," she said, her voice tinged with a quiet sadness. Donovan didn't speak for a moment. The weight of her words hung in the air between them. Then he stepped aside, motioning for her to leave. "You're being reassigned," he said, his voice firm again. "Frontline intel. Immediate promotion to specialist. You've earned it." Blake nodded once, her face impassive. As she turned to leave, Donovan's voice followed her, quieter this time. "Blake," he said, the name coming out with more reverence than he had ever used before. "I'm sorry they didn't see you, but they will now." The door closed behind her, and the mess hall that evening was quieter than usual. The usual banter was missing, replaced by a sense of uneasy respect. As Blake walked in, Sergeant Keeley, who had once taunted her, now looked up from his tray and nodded. It was a simple gesture, but it was enough. The others followed suit, each acknowledging her in their own way. No one made jokes, no one mocked her. The silence spoke louder than any words could have. From that moment on, Blake was no longer paper soldier. She was Echo, the soldier who had survived what they couldn't even imagine. Blake stood by the window, the faint sound of boots on the concrete outside barely reaching her ears. Her thoughts drifted back to that day in Syria, the day her life had changed forever. It felt like yesterday and a lifetime ago, all at once. She had been just another soldier, another face in the crowd of seasoned veterans, but that day she became something else. The operation had started like any other routine mission, a chance to prove herself among the best. Her squad was inserted into a remote location in northern Syria, tasked with locating and neutralizing a small insurgent group. They had intel, maps, and the experience of every soldier in the unit to guide them. Nothing was supposed to go wrong, but nothing ever goes as planned. They were ambushed less than an hour into their insertion. The sound of gunfire broke the stillness of the desert, the sharp cracks of AK-47s and the thundering blast of RPGs rattling through. The enemy had been waiting for them, and they knew the terrain far better than Blake's squad did. There was no time to react. The ambush hit hard, fast, and with deadly precision. Blake's squad was outgunned and outmanned. She could hear the screams of her fellow soldiers as they fell one by one, the acrid smell of smoke and gunpowder filling her lungs. Blake's training kicked in, but so did something else. A fierce determination. She moved through the chaos, her weapons steady, her mind calculating. She returned fire, her aim true, cutting down 2 hostiles before they could get another shot off. But there was no time to relish the kill. Her focus was on her team, on getting them out. She was the senior soldier in the field, and she couldn't afford to freeze. The fight dragged on, but it was clear they were losing. Her squad was disorganized, scattered, and overwhelmed. There were no reinforcements, no support, just the shrieking wind and the echoing gunfire. Blake moved toward Sergeant Rucker, who had taken a bullet to the chest, his face pale and sweat-drenched. He grabbed her hand weakly, his words barely audible over the distant gunfire. "Get them out, Blake. Finish it. Don't leave them." Blake's heart thundered in her chest, but she couldn't stay. There was no time for grief. Not yet. She dragged Rucker to cover, only to realize he wouldn't make it. His eyes locked onto hers, and in that final moment, he gave her a nod, a silent command. She had to finish the mission. She had to survive. After securing the wounded, Blake moved through the line, taking out 3 more hostiles in quick succession. The weight of the situation was heavy, but she focused on one step at a time. She knew the only way out was through the insurgent camp, and the only way to get there was by eliminating anyone who stood in her way. She didn't feel fear, not in that moment. She only felt a cold, controlled urgency, the need to complete the mission, to honor those who had already fallen. By the time the last enemy soldier was down, Blake was alone. The bodies of her comrades lay scattered across the sand, their sacrifice etched into the landscape. She moved quickly, dragging the wounded back toward the extraction point. The weight of her squad's loss was unbearable, but she pushed it down, burying it beneath her training and her duty. When Blake finally reached the extraction point, she was covered in blood, dust, and exhaustion. The helicopter arrived just in time, the rotors kicking up a blinding cloud of sand. She climbed aboard with the 2 surviving soldiers, Rucker's blood staining her uniform. There were no words between them. She didn't need words. The mission was complete, but the cost was clear. The ride back was a blur. Blake's body ached from the strain, her mind racing through the events, replaying them over and over again. She had done her job, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something essential had been ripped. away from her that day. The loss of her squad, of the men who had become her family, was a wound that no mission would ever heal. Blake's voice was steady as she spoke to Major Donovan later, recounting the events. She gave the details in a detached, clinical manner, as though she were reporting the events of a training exercise, not the brutal reality of war. She had to keep it together. She had to keep it professional. But inside, the weight of their deaths was suffocating. She had survived, but at what cost? The responsibility of it all pressed down on her. The tally marks on her wrist, each one representing a life she had taken, or a life she had saved, were a constant reminder of that day. There were 5 marks, one for each hostile she had eliminated, but each mark also represented something else: the men she couldn't save, the soldiers who had given their lives so she could finish the mission. Blake knew she would carry those scars, both visible and invisible, for the rest of her life. She had survived, but she wasn't the same person who had entered that mission. The soldier who returned was someone else entirely, someone who knew the price of survival, the cost of duty. The others would never understand the depth of what she had gone through, but that didn't matter. Blake didn't need their understanding. The marks on her wrist would speak for her. They would always remind her of the battle, of the sacrifices made, and of the responsibility she carried. Blake had learned the true cost of war. She had learned it in the heat of battle, with the blood of her comrades staining her hands and the weight of their deaths etched into her soul. She would never forget. Blake stood in front of Major Donovan's office door, her back straight and her posture as perfect as always. The faint sound of her boots echoed down the hallway, matching the steady rhythm of her heartbeat. She had been summoned to his office, though she wasn't sure why. The events of the morning, the revelation of her past, still hung heavy in the air. Now, she was about to face the consequences, or perhaps the recognition of her actions. Donovan's door opened with a soft creak, and she stepped inside without hesitation. He stood behind his desk, the same stern expression on his face, though his eyes were softer than before. There was no sign of the usual military rigidity in his posture, no clipped tone. He seemed almost tired, as if the weight of the past few hours had settled into his bones. "To Cadet Blake," Donovan said, his voice steady but carrying a hint of something else. Something like respect, though it was masked by his usual professionalism. "Please, have a seat." He gestured to the chair in front of his desk, and Blake nodded, moving slowly as if the weight of the conversation was already pressing on her shoulders. She sat down, her back straight, her hands folded neatly in her lap. There was a brief pause, one that felt too long, filled with the unspoken understanding that they were both caught between military protocol and something far deeper. Donovan glanced down at the papers on his desk, his fingers tapping the edge of the clipboard. "I read the after-action report, Blake," he said finally, his voice quieter now. "What you did out there, what you survived, it's more than most could ever handle. You've proven yourself beyond any measure of doubt." Blake didn't respond right away. There was no need for words. She had done her job, and that was enough. She wasn't here for praise or recognition. She was here because she had always been here, in this world of service, where action spoke louder than anything else. Donovan paused, taking a slow breath before continuing. "I owe you an apology," he said, looking at her, his eyes finally meeting hers with sincerity. "I should have recognized your potential much sooner. We, all of us, have been blind to what you were capable of. You've been dismissed, underestimated, and for that, I'm sorry." Blake's gaze never wavered. She didn't need his apology. There was no anger in her heart, no resentment. What had happened had happened. It was just the way things worked, the way things always worked. She had learned to let go of such expectations long ago. Her role was not to seek recognition, but to serve. Donovan seemed to sense her quiet resolve, and for a moment, the room was still. "You've earned more than just respect, Blake," he said, his voice firm but layered with something like reverence. "Effective immediately. I'm recommending your promotion to specialist. You'll be reassigned to frontline intelligence work." The words hit her like a quiet wave, leaving behind a rippling sense of inevitability. She had expected something like this, even if the moment felt strangely disconnected from the weight of it all. She nodded slightly, acknowledging his decision, but her expression remained unchanged. This was duty. This was what she had always done, and she had never expected anything more. "There's no need for celebration," Donovan continued, his voice softening. "This is what you've earned. I know you don't seek recognition, but I want you to understand that what you've done here today is something we all should have seen earlier. You're not just a soldier, Blake. You're a leader. You've been carrying the weight of this war alone, and I failed to see it. But I won't fail again." Blake took a breath, her fingers tightening slightly around the edge of the chair. It wasn't a reaction of joy, or even relief. It was a recognition of what was ahead, of the path she had always walked. This wasn't about her. It never had been. It was about the mission, the others, the ones who hadn't made it back. "I'll do my job, sir," Blake replied quietly, her voice steady and low. "That's all I've ever done." There was a moment of silence between them, one that seemed to carry the weight of everything unsaid. Donovan's expression softened, his lips pressing together in a tight line. "I'm sorry, Blake," he said again, his voice almost a whisper. "I'm sorry we didn't see you sooner, but I'm glad we do now." Blake didn't respond. She didn't need to. There was nothing to be said. Words were unnecessary now. Her actions had spoken for her, and they always would. The room fell into silence once more, and for the first time, Blake allowed herself to breathe. She had carried the weight of her past for so long, and now, though the burden would never truly be gone, there was a shift. The respect she had earned wasn't what mattered most, but the understanding, the quiet acknowledgement was enough. Donovan gave a small nod, signaling that their conversation had ended. Blake stood, her movements precise, like clockwork. She had already turned to leave when he spoke again. "Blake," he called, his tone now softer. "I expect you'll make a hell of a specialist." Blake paused for a moment, her hand on the doorframe. She turned her head slightly, offering him a brief nod before stepping out. There was no need for words, not now. The work was just beginning. As the door closed behind her, Blake walked down the hall with the same quiet determination she had always carried. She was just another soldier, another cog in the machine. But she was no longer invisible. The world would know her name, not because of some loud declaration, but because of the silent strength she had always carried. And in that, there was a quiet pride, a quiet victory. The mess hall was quieter than usual when Blake entered, her boots clicking against the cold tile floor. She glanced around, expecting the same mocking stares and hushed whispers, but instead, the room felt different. The clattering of trays and the murmurs of soldiers preparing for the days. Duties seemed subdued, almost respectful. It was as if the air itself had shifted overnight. Blake paused at the door, her eyes scanning the faces of her comrades, searching for something she hadn't expected to find acknowledgement. Sergeant Keeley, who had once been the loudest voice in her humiliation, stood from his seat as she entered. His usual smirk was absent, replaced by something else, something unspoken. He met her gaze, a silent nod of recognition, the only gesture he offered. It was a small thing, but to Blake, it was monumental. She had never received any sign of respect from him before, only disdain. But now, without a word, he had acknowledged her in a way that spoke volumes. She didn't respond, didn't speak. She simply walked past, her back straight and her steps steady, as if this moment, this quiet shift, was exactly where she belonged. The rest of the room followed suit. One by one, soldiers who had once dismissed her with laughter or cold indifference rose from their seats, offering her nods or slight waves. No one spoke. There was no need. The respect was palpable in the air, woven into each small movement, each silent acknowledgement. Blake could feel the weight of their gazes, but it wasn't the same weight as before. It wasn't the weight of mockery or dismissal. It was different. It was earned. As she walked deeper into the mess hall, the seats that had once been empty when she entered now seemed to fill with offers. A seat was pulled out here, a hand gestured there, inviting her to join. She was no longer an outsider, no longer paper soldier. No. Now they all knew her as Echo, the one who had survived, the one who had carried their burdens even when they hadn't seen it. She had no need for their words, the nickname, the gesture, the respect. It was all the acknowledgement she needed. Blake's steps didn't falter, though her heart tightened in her chest. She could feel the change, could see it in their eyes, but she remained silent, her expression as calm and impassive as ever. She moved toward a seat in the corner, choosing it not because it was away from the others, but because it was where she could be alone with her thoughts. As she settled in, her eyes caught the faces of the soldiers around her. They weren't just looking at her anymore. They were seeing her. The nickname had already spread throughout the room, and she knew that from now on. She wouldn't be referred to as anything but Echo. The name wasn't just a call sign. It wasn't just a label. It was a symbol of everything she had endured, everything she had sacrificed. The soldiers who had once mocked her now understood, at least in part, what she had been through. They understood the weight she carried, the resilience she had shown. They didn't need to hear the stories of her past. They could see it in her eyes, in her steady gaze, in the way she carried herself. For Blake, there was no celebration in the change. She didn't want the attention. She didn't want the acknowledgement. She had never been here for that. She had never been here to prove anything to anyone. But as the room settled into its new dynamic, as the soldiers began to treat her with the respect she had long deserved, she realized something. This wasn't about pride or validation. This was about the quiet understanding that had finally taken root. She had been seen, truly seen, for the first time. And that was enough. The day continued, the soldiers returning to their duties. But there was an unspoken shift in the air. Blake could feel it, the quiet respect, the unspoken recognition of her place among them. No one asked about her past. No one demanded stories or explanations. They simply accepted her as Echo, as the one who had survived what they hadn't. She was no longer a figure to be mocked or misunderstood. She was part of them now. As Blake finished her meal, she glanced around the room once more. The familiar faces were no longer unfamiliar. The soldiers who had once been distant, almost hostile, were now allies. It wasn't a perfect change, but it was enough. And for Blake, that was the most important thing. The road ahead would still be long, still filled with challenges, but now she knew she didn't have to walk it alone. The respect she had earned didn't come from grand gestures or loud declarations. It had come from the quiet strength she had shown, from the actions she had taken when no one else was watching. And that, she realized, was how it would always be. She didn't need anyone to speak her worth. Her survival, her resilience, her quiet determination, they had already spoken for her. Now, the rest of the world was finally listening. In the end, Blake's journey was never about loud victories or dramatic displays of bravery. True heroism, as she had come to understand, was often carried in silence, woven into the smallest of actions, the quietest of moments. Soldiers like her didn't roar when they faced the enemy, didn't seek glory in the aftermath. They simply did their duty, day in and day out, no matter the cost, no matter the recognition. Their strength wasn't measured by the noise they made, but by the resolve they showed in the face of unimaginable adversity. Blake's path from being misunderstood to gaining the respect of her peers wasn't about personal triumph or the praise of others. It was about the quiet strength that defined her character, the humility that kept her grounded even when the weight of her experiences could have easily broken her. Her battle had never been for recognition. It had always been for survival, for duty, and for the men and women who had fought beside her, the ones who never made it back. Her story wasn't one of exceptional displays of power or glory. It was a story of resilience, of continuing to move forward even when the world around her failed to notice, when others thought she was weak. But in the end, the true measure of a soldier's worth is not in the battles they fight, but in the battles they endure in silence. Real soldiers, the ones who carry the heaviest burdens, don't always stand out. They don't always get the cheers, the accolades, or the recognition. Sometimes the greatest victories are the ones achieved quietly without fanfare, without anyone to see them. These are the soldiers who don't seek the spotlight, who don't ask for applause. They simply serve quietly and steadfastly, because that's what they've been trained to do. Their true bravery isn't in the noise of a battle, but in their ability to endure, to fight, and to keep going even when no one is watching. Blake's story is a lesson in humility and sacrifice. It's a reminder that the bravest soldiers are not always the loudest or most visible. Sometimes they are the ones who stand in the background, doing what needs to be done without seeking validation or recognition. They fight because it's their duty, not because they expect anything in return. Their strength lies not in their words, but in their actions. They carry their battles in silence, and in that silence, they are the truest form of heroes. As you reflect on Blake's journey, consider your own perceptions of bravery and heroism. Are we too quick to overlook those who don't stand out? Those who don't seek attention. Real heroes often walk among us, their stories untold, their sacrifices unacknowledged, but they are no less deserving of our respect. They carry their battles silently, and in that silence, they shape the world around them. We should honor them, not because they seek it, but because they have earned it, through every quiet action, every unseen sacrifice. Blake's story serves as a reminder that we all have a part to play in, recognizing those who go unnoticed. Whether in the military or in our daily lives, we can all take a moment to reflect on those who serve quietly, who endure in silence. They may not ask for recognition, but they deserve it all the same. So, as you watch this story unfold, think about where you're watching from. Let us know where in the world you are, and let's honor these unsung heroes together. Share this story if it touched you, if you were moved by Blake's strength, and consider subscribing to hear more stories of resilience and courage. Sometimes the strongest soldiers are the ones who don't roar, and it's time we recognize that strength, not with noise, but with the quiet respect it deserves.